Hey there, survivors. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Before we dive into this spooky story, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe and leave a like. It helps more than you know. Now, let's get into the story. I've always been drawn to animals ever since I was a kid. While other kids played sports or learned instruments, I spent my days reading about wildlife and watching nature documentaries. My parents thought it was just a phase, something that would fade away once I found a new hobby. But it never did. My fascination only grew, and by the time I finished high school, I knew exactly where I wanted to be: the city zoo. It wasn't just any zoo either. Ours was famous for its exotic exhibits, extensive conservation programs, and dedicated volunteer efforts. Every corner told a story, and every habitat was built with such care that you could almost forget you were still in a bustling metropolis. I started out cleaning enclosures and feeding the more docile residents. In the mornings, I greet the giraffes with fresh leaves and a chipper good morning, as though they might answer me. In the afternoons, I'd check on the big cats, always from a safe distance, of course. When you're an intern, you follow the rules to the letter. Gradually, I gained more responsibilities, learned the routines, and developed a bond with nearly every creature under our care. I'd never have guessed that bond would be tested in a way that defied all logic and turned into a living nightmare. The day everything changed started like any other. I woke before dawn, stopping by a local coffee shop to fuel up. I stepped through the staff entrance of the zoo just as the sunlight began to filter over the treetops. The air always smelled of hay, fresh grass, and hints of the animals themselves. It was comforting, familiar. Even when I found the head zookeeper, Jordan, pacing near the security office, I assumed it was just another urgent meeting about a new arrival or some maintenance issue. Jordan's face was pale, his eyes darting around as though he expected something to leap from the shadows. "Listen," he whispered, pulling me aside. "We've got a situation in the quarantine enclosure." That enclosure was reserved for new or sick animals. Occasionally, we used it for creatures that arrived from other facilities, so we could monitor them for a few days. It was always quiet, almost eerily so. When an animal acted strangely, that's where we kept it, separate from the others. "What kind of situation?" I asked, yawning into my coffee. He chewed on his lip and lowered his voice further. "One of our new zebras started behaving erratically last night. The vet staff tried sedatives, but they're saying the animal didn't respond normally. They want us to keep everyone away until they finish running tests." My heart sank. The safety of our staff was paramount, and for a zebra, sedation almost always worked if done correctly. If it didn't, something was very wrong. Still, I couldn't have imagined what we'd discover in the hours that followed. Jordan led me into the security office, where our facility's cameras looped on several monitors. He rewound the footage from the quarantine enclosure. At first, the scene looked normal enough, the zebra lying down, breathing heavily. Then, around midnight, it jerked upright. Its limbs twitched, almost like invisible strings were controlling it. The overhead light glinted off its eyes, which seemed unfocused. Suddenly, it reared up, kicking at the walls of the enclosure with explosive force. I heard the sharp crack of hooves connecting with reinforced metal. The vet tech, a brave colleague named Angela, rushed in with a tranquilizer dart gun. As she fired, the zebra lunged. Even on the grainy footage, I could see something in its gaze, something not quite right. It struck Angela's shoulder with its muzzle, knocking her off balance. She scrambled back, just as a second dart hit the animal. Instead of succumbing to the tranquilizer, the zebra staggered once, then charged again. The image flickered as the camera feed cut out for a few seconds. When the feed resumed, Angela was gone. The zebra was pacing in a corner, its body trembling as if gripped by relentless pain or agitation. That's where the footage ended. Jordan shook his head. "I can't reach Angela on her phone. Emergency services are overwhelmed right now. Apparently, something is going on citywide. I just saw something about a possible viral outbreak on the news. People are panicking about a wave of what they're calling zombies." "Can you believe that?" I couldn't believe it either. We turned on the TV in the office, only to see frantic newscasters describing incidents of individuals acting strangely aggressive. They mentioned the word apocalypse more than once, though in a tongue-in-cheek manner. No one really believed it. It was all so surreal. Jordan turned off the TV. "We need to check on the quarantine enclosure in person," he said quietly. I nodded, trying to steady my racing heart. Together, we made our way to the far side of the zoo. The footpaths were mostly empty. Usually by mid-morning, families would be filing in, children excitedly pointing at the animals. Today the gates were locked, and the entrance closed until further notice. An unnatural silence clung to the walkways, broken only by the distant calls of birds. When we finally approached the quarantine area, I noticed something odd. The usually locked door to the staff corridor was slightly ajar. The security keypad was blinking red, as though someone had forced entry. Jordan motioned for me to stay behind him, but I stepped forward anyway. Every part of me wanted to run away, to lock myself in a supply closet until help arrived. But I had to know what happened to Angela, and to the poor zebra that had caused this entire alarm. Inside, the hallway lights flickered, painting everything in a sickly glow. A low hum filled the air, probably from the outdated electrical system. Each step made my pulse quicken. Halfway down the corridor, something shifted behind a corner. I froze. My first thought was that we'd run into the zebra, but that was impossible. No way could it navigate this corridor. Angela emerged. Her uniform was dirty, and her eyes looked distant. Relief surged through me. "Angela, are you okay?" I called. She didn't respond. Her movement seemed off, like she was a puppet guided by unsteady hands. Jordan reached out to her. That's when she let out a harsh, guttural sound. I'd never heard a person make a noise like that. It sent a chill straight through me. She staggered forward, arms limp at her sides. Jordan took a step back. Something inside me told me to run, but I stayed put, mouth agape. That's when I noticed a pattern of discolored veins on her neck, dark and twisting. She took another few steps, then lunged at Jordan. He cried out and tried to hold her off, calling her name, but she only let out another low moan. Her eyes seemed to lock onto him in a way that wasn't human at all. I hesitated, heart hammering. We had no idea what was going on. This didn't feel like any condition we'd studied. It felt primal, like Angela had lost all sense of herself. She wasn't the co-worker I'd known for years. She looked more like a predator eyeing its next meal. Finally, Jordan twisted free from her grip and pressed himself against the wall. "Angela, please," he pleaded. "We can help you." He never finished. With a final lurch, Angela lost her balance, collapsing in a heap. I dashed toward Jordan, grabbed his arm, and practically dragged him away. He was shaking, eyes brimming with confusion and horror. When I glanced back, Angela wasn't moving. We hurried into the main quarantine enclosure. The metal door was dented from the inside but still locked. Through the small viewing window, I could see the zebra pacing in circles. My breath caught. The animal's eyes were still wild and foam dripped from its muzzle. It let out a rasping bray that reverberated in the enclosed space. The floor was scratched and marked with hoofprints, as if the creature had been thrashing around for hours. A sudden noise behind us made me whirl around. Angela was standing in the hallway again, and she wasn't alone. 2 other staff members, also from the veterinary team, stood with her. They all wore that same vacant expression. Their arms hung limp, bodies swaying slightly as if they were moving on autopilot. A dreadful realization filled my mind. This was more than just a zebra problem. Something had spread, something that connected the infected people to the infected animals. And it was spreading fast. The news broadcasts about zombies and a citywide scare slammed back into my thoughts. Was this the same infection? Could the zebra have been a carrier of something more than just an animal pathogen? We needed answers, but first, we needed safety. Jordan whispered that we should hide in the Zookeeper's lounge, where we had an emergency radio. We slipped out a side door, careful not to draw the attention of the 3 staff members in the corridor. I felt a pang of guilt leaving them behind, but we were outmatched. The lounge was dim and cramped, furnished with a battered old couch, a snack machine, and some metal lockers. Jordan locked the door behind us and fumbled with the old radio. Static hissed, then gave way to an emergency broadcast. A frantic voice warned all citizens to remain indoors. The outbreak was real. Officials were calling it a virus that acted on the brain and nervous system, drastically altering behavior. There was no mention of the animals yet, but I had seen enough to suspect they were affected as well. This was bigger than any normal situation. It was starting to feel like an actual apocalypse. I turned on the lounge's computer to check the zoo's internal network. Usually, we recorded logs on animal health, feeding schedules, and other daily tasks. I hoped that the veterinarian's notes might reveal how the zebra came into our zoo and whether it had shown symptoms earlier. I found a recently updated file marked urgent. It belonged to Angela. The notes were incomplete, but I could read bits and pieces. Unidentified infection. Resembles known viruses, but mutates faster. Spreads through saliva or bodily fluids. Transmission vector unknown in animals. Sedatives less effective. Bizarre neurological response. Keep quarantine at highest level? Possible link to the citywide? My heart pounded as I read each line. Angela must have been typing these notes only hours earlier before she went to administer the sedatives herself. She'd concluded it might be linked to the same outbreak that was making headlines. And here it was, right in our zoo, mutating in the animals at an alarming rate. Jordan stared over my shoulder. "We have to let someone know about this," he said, voice trembling. "We can't keep it hidden. But look at the broadcasts. They already have chaos out there. Do you think anyone's going to listen if we say our animals are turning into zombies?" That word made me shiver. I'd always heard it in fiction, never in reality. Yet the city's newscasts had embraced it, an easy label for people acting like mindless aggressors. Now we had definitive proof that the infection wasn't limited to humans alone. Cautiously, I opened the lounge door, a crack to peer into the hallway. Empty, no sign of Angela or the others. We decided our best course of action was to check the other exhibits and warn any staff or visitors we found. Officially, the zoo had closed its gates, but there could still be stragglers on the premises. Quietly, we navigated the winding paths of the zoo. In the distance, I heard a sudden roar from the lion enclosure, deeper and more guttural than any lion's call I had ever heard before. My skin prickled. If the infection had spread to the big cats, we'd have a serious problem. I didn't dare check on them alone, so we moved on, scanning for staff. The primate house was next. It was eerily silent. Usually the monkeys or apes would be chattering or calling out. Instead, the entire building seemed deserted. My footsteps echoed off the tiled floors. Every enclosure was dark except for a single light near the exit sign. The smell of uncleaned cages hung thick in the air, a sign that our staff hadn't done the morning chores. Jordan and I exchanged a worried glance. Then we saw movement. A figure crouched in the far corner, next to an open enclosure gate. It was one of our keepers, Celia. She clutched at her arm, breathing heavily. When she spotted us, her eyes filled with relief. "Oh, thank goodness," she whispered. "It got some of the orangutans. They're acting strange, like they're not themselves anymore. One of them tried to..." She stopped herself, tears welling in her eyes. I knew what she meant. We had to stay calm. "Stay quiet," Jordan told her gently. "Are you hurt?" She nodded, showing us a superficial wound on her forearm. "An orangutan grabbed me, and, well, it scratched me. I think I got away before it did anything worse, but..." Her voice trembled. "I've never seen them so aggressive." I looked around. The open enclosure gate stood as a reminder that at least one of the animals could now roam the halls. I braced myself, half expecting it to leap from the shadows. Every moment felt like teetering on a knife's edge. "It's the same infection," I said softly, my voice catching in my throat. It's affecting the animals just like it's affecting humans out there. Celia nodded. We need to contain them, or else we're going to have a full-blown crisis in the zoo itself. The crisis was an understatement. We were talking about a potential apocalypse scenario within the confines of the zoo. Even worse, if these infected creatures found a way into the city, it might accelerate the outbreak tenfold. Jordan helped Celia to her feet, and we proceeded further into the building. A wave of dread washed over me as we passed each enclosure. I worried about the gorillas, the chimpanzees, and all the other primates that could be infected. Yet we saw none, just empty cages and open gates. They were out somewhere, and we had no idea how many had been exposed. After we reached the exit, we walked outside into the bright afternoon sun. The skies looked so normal, as if the day had no idea how terrible things were below. We needed to contact authorities, but the phone lines and cell networks were jammed. All of us jumped when a distant explosion rumbled, somewhere in the city. A thin plume of smoke rose beyond the walls of the zoo. We realized with rising horror that we weren't just dealing with our local outbreak. The entire city was in chaos. If the media was calling it a zombie apocalypse, even half sarcastically, that meant widespread panic. We had no way of knowing how many people were infected, or if any rescue would ever come. We decided to make our way to the reptile house, one of the most secure buildings on the grounds. It had thick walls and a reinforced door, perfect for keeping venomous reptiles safe from unauthorized entry. Now, it might be our best bet for a makeshift shelter. We trod carefully, avoiding the main path to reduce our chances of stumbling across infected staff or animals. A metal trash bin lay overturned, scraps of food strewn everywhere. The once lively zoo felt deserted and foreboding. When we finally reached the reptile house, we were met with silence. The interior lights flickered just as they had in the quarantine enclosure. I listened intently for any sound, a hiss from the snakes, a rustle from the lizards, but it was almost too quiet. Jordan tried the door, locked. He tapped a code into the keypad, and the door clicked open. Inside, the temperature was warm and slightly humid, controlled to mimic the tropical environments many reptiles call home. Tanks lined the walls, filled with exotic snakes, lizards, and amphibians. I swallowed hard, wondering if any of these creatures could catch the infection. How would we even tell if a snake was infected? Celia found a staff monitor near the entrance. She tapped at the screen, pulling up feeding logs. "It looks like the keepers haven't been in here yet today," she murmured. "No new notes." A clang sounded from deeper in the reptile house, near the staff-only corridor. I felt my stomach twist. We crept toward the noise, stepping carefully around the rows of enclosures. At the far end of the corridor, we caught sight of a shadow moving across the floor. For a moment, I thought it might be another staff member, but the figure's gait was all wrong, hunched and uneven. We ducked into a side room, hearts pounding, and listened as the figure shuffled past. A pungent, musty odor lingered. When the sound faded, we cautiously peered out. Whoever it was had vanished around the corner, leaving nothing but an echo of footsteps. Celia looked at us, face set with grim determination. "Maybe we can seal off the reptile house and try to barricade ourselves inside. It might be safer here than wandering around the zoo with those things." "We also need food," Jordan said. "There's a snack bar near the entrance. If it's not ransacked, we can grab supplies. Then we can return here and lock ourselves in." I considered the plan. Part of me was screaming to escape the zoo entirely, to race towards some government quarantine zone. But I didn't know if the city was any better off. We might run straight into infected crowds. At least in the zoo, we had some sense of the layout, plus locked enclosures. Slowly, we made our way back outside. The sun was beginning to set, and a purple-orange hue painted the sky. That's when I heard it. A distant roar. Maybe the lion or the tiger. Then came another noise like a shrill shriek. It could have been one of the monkeys. The realization that all these majestic, once captive animals were now potentially infected turned my stomach. A wave of guilt rushed over me for wanting to hide instead of trying to save them. But what could we do? This was bigger than any of us. We skirted along the outer fence, passing the silent flamingo pond and the sealed reptile gates. A single macaw perched on a branch above us, watching. It let out a cry, and I couldn't tell if it was just being a bird or something else. Every living thing around me felt suspicious. We reached the snack bar. Thankfully, the lights were still on inside, though the shutters were down. Jordan pried it open just enough for us to slip inside. We fumbled through the shelves, grabbing bottles of water, chips, energy bars, anything that could keep us going for a few days. I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. The weight of the situation was crushing. Outside, the wind rustled through the foliage, carrying with it the distant sound of unnatural howls. This infection surrounded us, and no official help seemed on the way. "Let's get back," Celia whispered, peering out from under the shutter. "I don't like the look of that storm coming in." I followed her gaze. Thunderheads were gathering overhead, and a gentle rain started to fall. The sky darkened, and I felt a deep sense of foreboding. With our bags stuffed full, we slipped back into the zoo, hugging the wall to avoid open spaces. As we passed the main plaza, we saw something that nearly stopped us in our tracks. A group of people, maybe 4 or 5, stumbling aimlessly. Their clothes were torn, and they moaned softly as they collided with one another. These were definitely infected individuals, drawn here for reasons unknown. One of them turned our way, and we froze. For a long moment, we were locked in that awful stare. Then the group drifted in another direction, their attention caught by something else. We hurried to the reptile house and locked the door behind us, securing it with every bolt we could find. Celia and Jordan moved among the enclosures, double-checking every tank and cage. No signs of forced openings, at least not in this section. For a moment, the 3 of us just stood there, exhausted, hearts hammering from the close call. "This might be the safest place for now," Jordan murmured. "But for how long?" Celia set down her bag of supplies. "We'll have to ration our food carefully, and we still don't know if any of these reptiles are infected." I sighed. "We'll have to keep watch and see. If they start showing signs, we'll deal with it then." A tense silence followed. Outside, lightning flashed, illuminating the corridor in blinding white. Thunder boomed, and rain pelted the roof. I wondered how many others in the city were taking shelter like we were, hoping this nightmare would simply pass. But nothing about this felt temporary. It felt like the start of something far worse, an unfolding apocalypse that we might not be able to stop. As we settled in, trying to formulate a plan, my mind drifted back to Angela and the other staff we had left behind. Were they still wandering the halls, searching for someone to infect, or something to consume? Was the infected zebra now free, roaming the zoo? My thoughts tumbled, and a cold dread spread through me. The infection had spread to animals, from zebras to orangutans, and there was no telling what other species might already be affected. Lightning flashed again, and I caught a glimpse of something outside one of the reptile house windows. It was just a shadow, maybe a tree branch blowing in the wind, or maybe something else entirely. I couldn't be sure. My thoughts spiraled with the knowledge that we were in uncharted territory. It was one thing to fear an outbreak among people, but to realize it included animals capable of raw power and ferocity made it even worse. Celia placed a hand on my shoulder. "We'll get through this," she said, attempting to sound reassuring. "One way or another." Jordan gave a half-hearted nod. "We have to warn the outside world that the infection isn't just in humans, but we can't do that until we can reach someone out there who can help. For now, we hold tight." I sank onto a crate, my legs finally giving way. My head spun with the images of infected animals, the city in panic, and the possibility that we were witnessing the start of a real zombie apocalypse. The word felt both ridiculous and terrifying, but everything I had seen so far suggested it was horribly real. Another bolt of lightning lit up the reptile house, followed by a deep rumble of thunder. Rain continued to hammer the roof, and droplets snaked down the windows. In the distance, I thought I heard the echo of something large moving outside. Maybe it was just the storm, or maybe it was another infected animal prowling the empty walkways, searching for its next target. None of us spoke. We just listened, waiting in the half-darkness. I closed my eyes, trying to ground myself. But my mind raced, plagued by the image of Angela's vacant stare and the zebra's wild eyes. Suddenly, the lights flickered again. The overhead bulbs dimmed, then flared back to life. I exchanged glances with Celia and Jordan. If the power went out, the reptile house's climate control systems would fail. That could jeopardize every creature inside, and us along with them. We had no idea what dawn would bring or whether we'd even see a rescue team. We were just 3 keepers surrounded by an unimaginable threat. Yet in that moment, I understood the gravity of our responsibility. We were the last line of defense for these creatures, infected or not. If the virus spread beyond our gates, it wouldn't just be a citywide crisis. It could turn into a global apocalypse, with countless infected animals roaming free. Jordan cleared his throat. We'll take shifts through the night, keep watch on the entrances and check for any unusual activity in the enclosures. Sound good? We both nodded. The next few hours could shape the future of the zoo, and maybe more than that. As I stared out the window, thunder rattling the glass, I tried to steady my nerves. The door behind us was barricaded. We had supplies for a few days, and we had each other. It would have to be enough. For now, all we could do was wait, locked in with the reptiles, while the storm raged outside and infected creatures roamed the zoo. My mind swirled with questions. Would reinforcements arrive? Would the city declare a total quarantine? Or was this silent zoo just the tip of a crisis so vast that no one could contain it? I didn't have the answers. No one did. The only certainty was that the animals I had spent my life caring for were not the same anymore. And if the infection could jump between species, then nothing was off limits. We were living through the opening act of an apocalypse that might forever change our world. As I stood by the window gazing at the dark shapes beyond, I couldn't help but wonder if, by sunrise, we'd still be here to see what came next, or if we'd join the ranks of the infected, roaming these hallways with lifeless eyes, just like Angela and the others.